On a busy Friday evening in downtown Seattle, Mr. Chen walked into Golden Palace Restaurant, the establishment he had quietly owned for the past 15 years. Unlike his usual visits where he'd announce himself as the owner, today he decided to dine as a regular customer. He wanted to experience firsthand how his staff treated everyday patrons when they thought no one was watching. The restaurant was bustling with life, dishes clinking, conversations flowing, and the aromatic scent of authentic Chinese cuisine filling the air. Mr. Chen, dressed in simple jeans and a worn sweater, took a seat at a corner table. He noticed how the newly hired manager, Mrs. Wu, was instructing the staff with an air of superiority he'd never seen during his announced visits. A young waitress approached his table, barely making eye contact as she tossed a menu his way. "Let me know when you're ready," she muttered before rushing off to chat with her co-workers by the service station. Mr. Chen observed how different sections of the restaurant received varying levels of attention. Customers in designer clothes got prompt service, while those in casual attire were left waiting. As he sat there, Mr. Chen overheard Mrs. Wu speaking rudely to an elderly couple who had complained about their cold soup. "If you don't like it, you don't have to eat here," she said dismissively, making the couple shrink in their seats. His heart sank. This wasn't the welcoming atmosphere he'd worked so hard to create over the years. 20 minutes passed, and still no one had returned to take his order. He watched as 3 different servers walked past his table, each avoiding eye contact. When he finally managed to wave someone down, the server rolled her eyes before approaching. "What do you want?" she asked, tapping her pen impatiently against her notepad. Mr. Chen politely ordered the house special, a dish he himself had created, along with some jasmine tea. "The house special will take too long," the server replied. "Maybe you should order something else." He insisted on his choice, and she walked away with an audible sigh. From his corner, he witnessed multiple instances of poor service, servers gossiping instead of attending to tables, Mrs. Wu berating kitchen staff loud enough for customers to hear, and hefty automatic gratuities being added to bills without informing guests. The food, when it finally arrived 45 minutes later, was barely warm. The presentation, once a point of pride for Golden Palace, looked rushed and careless. The rice was overcooked, and the sauce, his secret recipe, tasted nothing like it should. When he tried to catch someone's attention to mention these issues, he was consistently ignored. A family at the next table received their food with several items missing from their order. When they attempted to point this out, Mrs. Wu argued that they never ordered those dishes in the first place, despite the father showing her their original order slip. The family left without finishing their meal, their special occasion ruined. Mr. Chen's heart grew heavier with each passing moment. He thought about his parents, who had started this restaurant with their life savings, about the countless customers who had become like family over the years, and about the reputation they'd built through decades of hard work and genuine care for their patrons. As the evening progressed, he witnessed Mrs. Wu turn away a group of young students, claiming their table was reserved, only to seat a well-dressed couple moments later at the same table. The students, who had walked several blocks in the rain to try the restaurant they'd heard so much about, left disappointed and soaking wet. Near closing time, Mr. Chen overheard Mrs. Wu instructing servers to rush the remaining customers out by clearing tables aggressively and turning up the lights, practices he had specifically prohibited. The final straw came when she berated a young busboy for accidentally breaking a plate, making him pay for it out of his wages, another violation of restaurant policy. Throughout the evening, Mr. Chen had filled 3 pages of his small notebook with observations. The restaurant he'd poured his heart into had become unrecognizable under the new management. The warm, family atmosphere had been replaced by an environment of discrimination, disrespect, and poor service. As the last customers filed out, looking notably less happy than when they'd arrived, Mr. Chen remained at his table, his bill still unpaid. Mrs. Wu approached him with an irritated expression. "We're closed," she announced curtly. "You need to leave now." Mr. Chen slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed his business card. The color drained from Mrs. Wu's face as she read his name and title. The servers who had ignored him all evening stopped their cleaning duties, watching the scene unfold with growing horror. "I think," Mr. Chen said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant, "we need to have a staff meeting. Right now." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of changes to come. His restaurant, his parents' legacy, would return to what it was meant to be, a place where every customer, regardless of their appearance or status, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. This was just the beginning of the changes that would reshape Golden Palace Restaurant, and Mr. Chen was determined to make things right, no matter what it took. The staff meeting that night lasted until well past midnight. Mr. Chen sat at the head of the largest dining table, his notebook open before him, while his employees occupied the surrounding chairs. The once confident Mrs. Wu sat with her head bowed, her earlier arrogance replaced by nervous fidgeting. "I didn't buy this restaurant to make money," Mr. Chen began, his voice calm but firm. "I bought it to preserve something special." He shared the story of how he'd first visited Golden Palace as a college student, surviving on instant noodles but saving every spare dollar to eat there once a month. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had always treated him like family, sometimes sneaking extra dumplings onto his plate when they thought he looked too thin. As he spoke, several servers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, particularly those who had ignored him earlier. Mr. Chen pulled out a stack of comment cards and online reviews from the past 3 months, complaints he'd been quietly monitoring. The sharp decline in customer satisfaction coincided perfectly with Mrs. Wu's appointment as manager. "Mrs. Wu," he addressed her directly, "you were hired because of your impressive resume and experience at high-end restaurants. But Golden Palace isn't about luxury or exclusivity. It's about making everyone feel at home." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And tonight, I felt anything but welcome in my own home." The young busboy who had been forced to pay for the broken plate raised his hand tentatively. Mr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "Sir," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been working double shifts because 3 of our staff quit last month. They couldn't handle." He glanced nervously at Mrs. Wu before continuing. The restaurant's head chef, who had worked there for over a decade, revealed that Mrs. Wu had been cutting corners on ingredients to reduce costs, compromising the quality of beloved recipes. Mr. Chen listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. The more he heard, the clearer the picture became. His restaurant hadn't just been suffering from poor service, it had lost its soul. The warm, familial atmosphere that had made Golden Palace special had been replaced by a cold, corporate environment that prioritized quick turnover and premium customers. "Starting tomorrow," Mr. Chen announced, "we're going back to basics." He outlined his plan, a 2-week retraining period for all staff, with the restaurant operating at reduced hours. They would review not just service protocols and recipes, but the values that had made Golden Palace a community landmark. Mrs. Wu stood up, straightening her designer blazer. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, these changes will reduce our profit margin significantly. The new system I implemented has increased revenue by 20%. And we've lost something worth far more," Mr. Chen replied, pulling out a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed him as a young man, standing proudly in front of the restaurant with the previous owners. "We've lost the trust of our community." He turned to address the entire staff. "Everyone here has a choice to make. If you want to be part of rebuilding Golden Palace's reputation, you're welcome to stay. Those who prefer Mrs. Wu's approach can leave with a month's severance pay." He paused, making eye contact with each person. "But if you stay, understand that every customer who walks through that door is family." The next morning, Mr. Chen arrived at 5 a.m. to find half the staff already there, including the young busboy who had arrived extra early to repair wobbly tables he'd been too afraid to mention before. The kitchen staff was excitedly discussing ways to improve their stations, and 2 servers were cleaning windows that had been neglected for months. Mrs. Wu arrived last, carrying a box of her personal belongings. She placed her resignation letter on Mr. Chen's desk without a word. As she walked toward the door, she stopped briefly. "I thought I was making this place better," she said quietly. "I didn't realize what I was destroying." Mr. Chen spent the next few days working alongside his staff, teaching them the original recipes, sharing stories about regular customers, and demonstrating the kind of service that had made Golden Palace special. He showed them how to read guests' needs without judgment, how a tired parent with rowdy children might need extra patience, or how a solo diner might appreciate a friendly word. The kitchen was reorganized to its original layout, and Mr. Chen personally contacted his old suppliers to restore the quality of ingredients. He reinstated the family meal tradition, where staff shared dinner together before the evening service, fostering a sense of community among the team. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the changes at Golden Palace. Regular customers who had stopped coming began cautiously returning. Mr. Chen made a point of visiting each table, not as the owner, but as someone genuinely interested in their lives and experiences. One evening, the elderly couple who had been humiliated over the cold soup returned. The entire staff held their breath as they were seated, but Mr. Chen had prepared for this moment. He personally served them the same soup, now steaming hot and made with his mother's recipe. By the end of their meal, the couple was smiling, sharing stories about their grandchildren with their server. The young students who had been turned away in the rain came back too, encouraged by positive reviews on social media. This time, they were welcomed warmly, and when they mentioned they were studying for finals, the kitchen sent out extra portions of brain food, a gesture that would have been impossible under the previous management. As the second week of retraining drew to a close, Mr. Chen gathered his staff again. The energy in the room was different now, hopeful, excited, united. The previous night's service had run smoothly, with genuine smiles and satisfied customers. The restaurant was beginning to feel like home again. "Tomorrow, we reopen at full capacity," Mr. Chen announced. "Remember, we're not just serving food, we're taking care of family." He looked around the room at his team, seeing not employees but partners in preserving something precious. "Every person who walks through that door has a story. Our job is to make sure their time here becomes a good chapter in that story." The staff nodded in agreement, understanding now what Golden Palace truly meant to the community. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a place where memories were made, where celebrations were shared, and where everyone, regardless of who they were, could feel like they belonged. That night, as Mr. Chen locked up, he paused to look at the old photograph again. He could almost hear the previous owners telling him he'd done the right thing. Golden Palace wasn't just a business to be profitable, it was a legacy of hospitality, kindness, and respect. And now, that legacy would continue, stronger than ever. The local media's attention on Golden Palace's transformation had brought unexpected challenges. While business was booming, Mr. Chen noticed some customers were coming more for the story than the experience. Food bloggers arrived with elaborate camera setups, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere for other diners. Social media influencers demanded special treatment, claiming they could make or break the restaurant's reputation. One particularly busy evening, a well-known food critic arrived unannounced. The staff, having learned from their previous experiences, treated him just like any other guest, with genuine warmth and respect. The critic seemed surprised when his attempts to get preferential treatment were met with polite but firm explanations that every customer was equally important at Golden Palace. During his meal, the critic witnessed something that would later become the centerpiece of his review. An elderly woman, clearly confused and distressed, wandered into the restaurant. Instead of turning her away, the staff discovered she had become separated from her family while shopping. While they contacted her worried relatives, they served her hot tea and dumplings, refusing payment when her daughter finally arrived to pick her up. "This is what hospitality truly means," the critic wrote in his review. In an age of Instagram-worthy plates and viral marketing, Golden Palace reminds us that a restaurant can be more than just a place to eat, it can be a cornerstone of community. The review brought even more attention, but Mr. Chen remained focused on maintaining the restaurant's core values. He implemented a strict, no special treatment policy, even when local celebrities began frequenting the establishment. The only exceptions were for elderly customers who needed extra assistance or families with young children who required more attention. One evening, a group of business investors arrived, asking to speak with Mr. Chen. They had been impressed by Golden Palace's revival and wanted to discuss the possibility of franchising the restaurant. The offer was substantial, enough money to secure his retirement and his children's education. Mr. Chen invited them to join him for dinner, listening to their elaborate plans for expanding Golden Palace into a chain. They spoke of standardized menus, efficient service protocols, and maximized profit margins, everything that Mrs. Wu had tried to implement. As they talked, Mr. Chen observed the regular dinner service around them. He watched as his staff remembered a regular customer's dietary restrictions without being reminded, consoled a young student who had just failed an important exam, and celebrated with a couple who had gotten engaged at the restaurant years ago. "Gentlemen," Mr. Chen finally said, after their plates had been cleared, "what you're proposing would make Golden Palace more profitable, but it would also make it less special. This restaurant isn't just about food or service, it's about connections that can't be franchised." The investors left disappointed, but Mr. Chen felt lighter for having maintained his principles. That same evening, he received news that would test those principles even further. A major food delivery app was featuring Golden Palace in their promotional campaign, offering massive discounts without the restaurant's permission. The surge of delivery orders threatened to overwhelm the kitchen and compromise the quality of service for dine-in customers. Some staff members suggested temporarily suspending dine-in service to focus on deliveries, arguing that the exposure would be good for business. Instead, Mr. Chen made a bold decision. He completely opted out of all delivery apps, focusing solely on dine-in customers and their own takeout service. He believed that the Golden Palace experience couldn't be packaged in a delivery box. The decision initially led to a drop in revenue, but something unexpected happened. Regular customers began coming more frequently, appreciating the quieter atmosphere and attentive service. They brought friends and family, sharing stories of why Golden Palace was special to them. A local business association took notice of Mr. Chen's commitment to quality over profit. They invited him to speak at their annual conference about maintaining business integrity in the digital age. Mr. Chen was reluctant at first, but he saw an opportunity to share an important message. Standing at the podium, dressed in his chef's jacket rather than a business suit, Mr. Chen spoke from the heart. He talked about the night he had experienced poor service in his own restaurant, but focused more on the lessons learned and the importance of staying true to one's values. "Success isn't just about numbers," he told the audience. "It's about creating something meaningful. In my restaurant, every customer has a name, every meal has a story, and every interaction matters. You can't automate genuine care or franchise personal connections." His speech resonated beyond the business community. Local restaurants began reaching out, asking for advice on building stronger relationships with their customers. Mr. Chen always shared the same message: treat every customer like family, and success will follow. Back at Golden Palace, the staff had internalized these values so deeply that they no longer needed guidance on how to handle difficult situations. When a competitor's restaurant was temporarily closed due to a fire, they welcomed their staff to work at Golden Palace until repairs were completed. When a regular customer lost his job, they discreetly provided meals on the house until he got back on his feet. These acts of kindness weren't part of any marketing strategy or customer retention program. They were simply the natural extension of the values Mr. Chen had worked so hard to restore. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Mr. Chen sat in the same corner table where he had experienced such poor service. This time, however, he wasn't there to evaluate his staff. He was simply enjoying a quiet dinner, watching with pride as his restaurant operated exactly as he had always envisioned it should. The food was excellent, the service attentive but not overbearing, and most importantly, every customer was treated with equal respect and care. Golden Palace had become more than just a successful restaurant, it had become a model for how businesses could thrive while maintaining their humanity. The 5th month after Golden Palace's transformation brought unexpected challenges that tested the restaurant's renewed spirit. A severe winter storm hit the city, causing power outages across several neighborhoods. While many restaurants closed their doors, Mr. Chen saw an opportunity to prove that Golden Palace's commitment to community wasn't just a fair-weather promise. Using the restaurant's backup generator, they kept their kitchen running. Mr. Chen transformed the dining room into a temporary warming station for nearby residents without power. The staff voluntarily came in, serving hot tea and simple meals to anyone who needed them. They pushed tables together, creating communal spaces where strangers became friends over steaming bowls of soup. A local high school teacher who had taken shelter at the restaurant noticed how efficiently the staff handled the crisis. She asked Mr. Chen if he would consider letting her students learn about business ethics by studying Golden Palace. This sparked an idea that would become one of the restaurant's most meaningful initiatives. Mr. Chen established a weekly program where students could learn about restaurant management, but with a focus on ethical business practices and community service. The program quickly became popular, with students experiencing firsthand how treating people with dignity could be both good ethics and good business. One student's project particularly moved Mr. Chen. The teenager had noticed that some elderly customers struggled to visit the restaurant during weekdays when their families were busy. She proposed a monthly, Community Sunday, where volunteers would help transport seniors to and from the restaurant. The initiative not only helped the elderly but also brought different generations together. During one such Community Sunday, an elderly customer shared stories about how the previous owners had helped her family when they first immigrated to the city. Mr. Chen realized that Golden Palace's role in the community wasn't new, it was a legacy he had inherited and nearly lost under Mrs. Wu's management. Word of Golden Palace's community initiative spread, inspiring other local businesses. A nearby bakery started offering free bread to families in need. A coffee shop began hosting weekly gatherings for isolated seniors. The neighborhood was experiencing a revival of community spirit, with Golden Palace at its heart. But success brought its own challenges. Some staff members, seeing the restaurant's prosperity, suggested raising prices to match upscale establishments in the area. Mr. Chen called a special meeting to address this. "Our success isn't measured in dollars," he reminded them, gesturing to the wall where he'd hung photos of memorable moments from the past months. "It's measured in the lives we touch. Higher prices might bring more profit, but they would exclude the very people who make this place special." To emphasize his point, he shared a letter he'd received that morning. A young couple wrote about how they'd had their first date at Golden Palace years ago, but couldn't afford fancy restaurants. Now successful, they still chose Golden Palace for their anniversary because it felt like home. The staff's eyes welled up as Mr. Chen read the letter. They understood that maintaining affordable prices was part of their mission. The restaurant's reputation continued to grow, but not in the way high-end establishments typically did. Instead of being known for exclusive dining experiences, Golden Palace became famous for its inclusive atmosphere. Business executives sat next to construction workers, students shared tables with retirees, and everyone received the same warm, respectful service. One day, a food magazine contacted Mr. Chen, wanting to feature Golden Palace in their Hidden Gems section. The reporter was surprised to find that Mr. Chen requested any article focus not on him or the food, but on the community that made the restaurant special. During the interview, a regular customer interrupted to give Mr. Chen a handmade thank you card. His young daughter had been hospitalized, and the restaurant staff had been sending home-cooked meals to the family every day. The reporter witnessed firsthand how Golden Palace was more than just a business, it was a vital part of people's lives. The article, when published, captured the essence of what made Golden Palace unique. It wasn't the perfectly prepared dishes or the efficient service, though both were excellent. It was the feeling that everyone who walked through the door became part of an extended family. Mr. Chen used the magazine feature as an opportunity to introduce a new tradition. Every month, the restaurant would close for one evening to host a community dinner where everyone ate together at long tables, sharing stories and forming connections. These dinners became legendary in the neighborhood, with people from all walks of life breaking bread together. During one such dinner, an elderly man stood up to share his story. He had been one of the customers poorly treated during Mrs. Wu's tenure and had vowed never to return. But after hearing about the changes and experiencing them firsthand, he not only came back but brought his entire extended family. "This place," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "reminds me of what community used to mean." As autumn approached, Mr. Chen received news that Mrs. Wu had opened her own upscale restaurant across town. Some staff members worried about the competition, but Mr. Chen remained unruffled. "We're not in the same business," he explained. "She's selling meals. We're nurturing connections." His words proved prophetic. While Mrs. Wu's restaurant attracted wealthy clients with its expensive menu and exclusive atmosphere, Golden Palace continued to thrive by staying true to its values. The contrast between the two establishments became a talking point in the city's restaurant scene, with Golden Palace often cited as an example of how success and social responsibility could go hand in hand. One evening, as Mr. Chen watched his dining room full of happy customers, he noticed a familiar face, the young waitress who had ignored him that fateful night. She had left during the transition but now stood nervously at the entrance. Without hesitation, he welcomed her back, not as an employee but as a customer, showing that Golden Palace's spirit of inclusion extended even to those who had once been part of its darkest chapter. 3 years had passed since that pivotal night when Mr. Chen had experienced poor service in his own restaurant. Golden Palace had not only recovered from its darkest period but had blossomed into something even more special than before. On this particular evening, Mr. Chen stood in the kitchen, preparing for a celebration that would mark an important milestone. The restaurant was hosting a special anniversary dinner, but not to celebrate its success. Instead, Mr. Chen had organized the event to honor the regular customers, staff members, and community partners who had been part of Golden Palace's journey. The guest list included everyone from the elderly couple who had received cold soup years ago to the young busboy who was now attending culinary school with Mr. Chen's recommendation. As guests arrived, they found the dining room transformed. Photos covered the walls, not of food or celebrities, but of everyday moments that made Golden Palace special. There was the image of students celebrating graduation, families reuniting after long separations, and countless birthday celebrations. Each photo told a story of connection and community. The most surprising guest of the evening was Mrs. Wu herself. She had asked to attend, not as a former manager, but as someone who had learned valuable lessons from her mistakes. When she walked in, there was an initial moment of tension, but Mr. Chen's warm welcome set the tone for everyone else. During dinner, Mrs. Wu stood up to speak. Her voice trembled as she addressed the room. "I thought I knew everything about running a successful restaurant," she admitted. "But I knew nothing about building a successful community. What I saw as inefficiency, spending time with customers, remembering their stories, treating everyone equally, was actually the heart of true hospitality." Her words resonated with the gathering, especially with the newer staff members who had only heard stories about the restaurant's difficult period. It served as a powerful reminder of how close Golden Palace had come to losing its soul in pursuit of profit. The evening's most touching moment came when a group of regular customers presented Mr. Chen with a handmade recipe book. They had collected family recipes from everyone who considered Golden Palace their second home. Each recipe came with a story about what the restaurant meant to them. Mr. Chen, usually composed, found himself wiping away tears as he flipped through the pages. Later that night, after most guests had left, Mr. Chen sat at his favorite corner table with his original notebook, the one where he had documented all the problems 3 years ago. Next to each old complaint, he now wrote down how that challenge had led to positive change. The young waitress who had ignored him was now running her own successful coffee shop, implementing the lessons she had learned about community-focused business. The kitchen staff who had been berated by Mrs. Wu had developed a mentorship program for aspiring chefs from underprivileged backgrounds. Even the physical space of Golden Palace told a story of transformation. The worn tables that had once been seen as shabby were now preserved, each scratch and dent representing countless shared meals and conversations. The simple decor that Mrs. Wu had wanted to replace with upscale furnishings now felt perfectly suited to the restaurant's welcoming atmosphere. Mr. Chen's daughter, who had recently graduated from business school, sat down beside him. "Dad," she said, "my professors would say your business model doesn't make sense. You could be making so much more money." He smiled, gesturing to the last few customers lingering over their tea, engaged in warm conversation. "Look around," he replied. "What do you see?" She observed the scene, a young couple on their first date sharing dessert with an elderly man dining alone, a student getting advice from a regular customer about job applications, and staff members who stayed past their shifts just to be part of the community they had helped build. "I see wealth that can't be counted," she answered, understanding now what her father had been protecting all along. As they prepared to close for the night, an unexpected group walked in, the health inspectors who had conducted their annual review earlier that day. Instead of turning them away, the staff welcomed them to join the last few minutes of celebration. The head inspector revealed that Golden Palace had received their highest rating, not just for cleanliness and food safety, but for their exceptional commitment to community well-being. Mr. Chen gathered his staff for their nightly meeting, but this time, he let them lead the discussion. One by one, they shared their own stories of transformation, how working at Golden Palace had changed their understanding of success, service, and community. The young busboy, now a part-time culinary student, spoke last. "When I started here, I was afraid of making mistakes," he said. "Now I understand that the biggest mistake would be forgetting why we're here, not just to serve food, but to serve people." As Mr. Chen locked up that night, he paused to look at the restaurant's sign glowing softly in the darkness. The characters for Golden Palace had been recently repainted, but he had insisted on keeping the original design. Like the restaurant itself, it was a perfect blend of honoring tradition while embracing positive change. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything by not paying attention, and how that near disaster had ultimately led to something greater than he could have imagined. Golden Palace wasn't just a restaurant that had recovered from its biggest mistake, it had transformed that mistake into its greatest strength. Walking home through the quiet streets, Mr. Chen reflected on how a simple decision to dine anonymously in his own restaurant had sparked a movement of compassion and community in their neighborhood. The biggest mistake had indeed been disrespecting the owner, not just him as an individual, but the true owners of any successful business, the community it serves.